Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House is voting today to impeach President Trump for the second time in his single term. Lawmakers will vote on one article of impeachment against Trump for inciting the deadly riot at the U.S. Capitol last week, which left 5 people dead. On Tuesday, House lawmakers approved a resolution calling for Trump to be removed by invoking the 25th Amendment. But Vice President Mike Pence rejected that effort. Pence spoke with Trump Monday evening in the Oval Office in their first meeting since last week's mob violence. Among the chants of the mob, "Hang Mike Pence." 4 House Republicans said Tuesday they would vote to impeach President Trump, including Wyoming Congressmember and Republican House Leader Liz Cheney, the third-ranking Republican in the House. The White House says they expect at least 20 Republicans will support impeachment, though other estimates are lower. The New York Times reports Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell believes Trump committed impeachable offenses and privately supports Democrats' efforts to remove him, which he hopes will help purge Trump from the Republican Party. Meanwhile, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, a close Trump ally, has reportedly asked other Republicans if he should call on Trump to resign. Trump continues to deny any involvement or responsibility for the violent insurrection last Wednesday, calling his pre-riot speech totally appropriate and casting himself again as the victim of a witch hunt. He instead blamed Democrats for fomenting anger and creating a dangerous situation.
This impeachment is causing tremendous anger, and you're doing it, and it's really a terrible thing that they're doing. For Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer to continue on this path, I think it's causing tremendous danger to our country, and it's causing tremendous anger. I want no violence.
President-elect Joe Biden has reportedly spoken to Mitch McConnell this week about using the process of bifurcation once he's sworn in, which would allow impeachment proceedings to go ahead while at the same time allowing for the confirmation of his cabinet picks and taking up a sweeping pandemic relief package. The Washington Post is reporting the FBI explicitly warned of violence and war at the U.S. Capitol in an internal report issued one day before last Wednesday's deadly invasion. The report cited online posts, including one which said, quote, "Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors being kicked in, and blood from their BLM and Pantifa slave soldiers being spilled. Get violent. Stop calling this a march or rally or a protest. Go there ready for war. We get our president or we die," the statement said. Pantifa is a derogatory reference to Antifa or anti-fascist protesters. The military's Joint Chiefs of Staff have issued a rare joint message condemning the riot at the U.S. Capitol. The chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, signed on to the letter, which reads in part, "The rights of freedom of speech and assembly do not give anyone the right to resort to violence, sedition, and insurrection," unquote. Illinois Congressmember Brad Schneider is at least the 3rd lawmaker to test positive for COVID-19 following the Capitol Hill lockdown, during which multiple Republican lawmakers refused to wear face masks in cramped isolation spaces with their Democratic colleagues. The House adopted a new rule Tuesday, which would fine lawmakers if they refuse to wear a face mask on the floor. They will face a $500 fine for the first offense, and a second strike incurs a $2,500 fine, which would be deducted from their pay. New Jersey Democrat Congressmember Mikey Sherrill said Tuesday she witnessed unnamed Republican colleagues giving reconnaissance tours one day before the riot, and that she would make sure those lawmakers are held accountable. Meanwhile, New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says she had a, quote, "very close encounter during the Capitol siege, during which she feared for her life." She refrained from providing further details, but said in an Instagram live post Tuesday her fellow right-wing Congress members contributed to her fears that day.
I myself did not even feel safe going to that extraction point because there were QAnon and white supremacist sympathizers and, frankly, white supremacist members of Congress in that extraction point who I know and who I had felt would disclose my location.
Ali Alexander, a leader of last week's so-called Stop the Steal riot, has said 3 Republican House members helped organize last week's violent attack on the Capitol: House Freedom Caucus head, Congressmember Andy Biggs, Paul Gosar of Arizona, and Mo Brooks of Alabama. Meanwhile, around the country, law enforcement and the military are looking into whether their members took part in last week's violent Capitol attack. Philadelphia Transit Police are investigating 7 officers who took part in the siege. The FBI has opened some 170 cases on individuals involved in the assault and says hundreds more will be opened in the coming weeks. Over 70 people have been charged so far. This comes as the FBI is warning Trump loyalists plan to hold armed protests nationwide ahead of Biden's inauguration next week. Screenshots of archived content appear to show plans for mass armed actions in Washington, D.C. this weekend. The plans posted by the Patriot Action for America involve sending 15,000 armed extremists to surround government buildings and lock down central D.C. In Indiana, officials at the federal prison in Terre Haute executed Lisa Montgomery today in the early hours of the morning, despite a series of last-minute court orders that temporarily halted her death. The Supreme Court ultimately sided with Trump and ruled to proceed with her execution. Montgomery was the only woman on federal death row and the first woman to be executed by the U.S. government in nearly 70 years. Her lawyers repeatedly argued that a lifetime of sexual abuse and trauma led to severe mental illness. The federal government has also appealed stays on the executions of Corey Johnson and Dustin Higgs, who are scheduled to die later this week. The U.S. reported a new world record for COVID-19 deaths Tuesday, with 4,327 people dying around the country. Over 215,000 new cases were reported. In an effort to speed up the rollout of vaccines, the Centers for Disease Control has expanded its guidelines to include eligibility to anyone 65 years old and older, as well as those with some underlying health conditions. This is Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar.
Every vaccine dose that is sitting in a warehouse rather than going into an arm could mean one more life lost or one more hospital bed occupied.
The CDC also announced Tuesday it will start requiring all international travelers to the U.S. to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test before boarding their flights. In California, the superintendent of the Los Angeles School District said students must get vaccinated when it becomes possible before they're allowed to return to campus. In international news, Indian authorities have started distributing COVID-19 vaccine doses in its effort to administer shots to 1.3 billion people in what officials are calling the world's biggest vaccination drive. Malaysia suspended its parliament and state legislatures, declaring a state of emergency amidst a new lockdown. Rights groups say the extraordinary measure is an attempt by the Prime Minister to hold on to power by blocking elections and removing parliamentary oversight. In the Middle East, Israel's refused a request from the World Health Organization to make coronavirus vaccines available to Palestinian medical workers. Israel rolled out its vaccine at record speed, but has come under fire for neglecting to vaccinate Palestinians in the occupied territories. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo Tuesday claimed al-Qaeda's new home base is Iran and that the group has centralized its leadership in Tehran. Pompeo did not provide any substantial evidence. Iranian officials immediately refuted the allegations. This comes as Iranian leaders have warned the Trump administration may be planning an attack before President-elect Joe Biden is sworn in next week. India's Supreme Court has stayed the implementation of highly contested farm laws that seek to deregulate agricultural markets. The laws triggered historic ongoing protests outside New Delhi and around the country since late November. The court is appointing a committee to hear farmers' grievances. The Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has said he would not repeal the laws, while farmers have vowed to keep protesting as long as needed. In Ireland, a devastating new report details the neglect and other abuse faced by tens of thousands of babies, children and women at so-called mother and baby homes, which were run by the Catholic Church from the 20s to the 1990s. An estimated 9,000 children and babies died in the homes, which were created to hide away unmarried pregnant people in the strict Catholic country. The government will issue a formal state apology to the survivors. This is Peter Mulryan, who survived one such home, describing the abuse he and others faced.
We're neglected, no love showing whatsoever. It wouldn't have been done to animals what we had to suffer. And babies crying through the night. Why? Because they were uncomfortable, they were neglected, starved and cold.
In Nigeria, prominent journalist and activist Omoyele Sowore has been released by authorities following his arrest at a peaceful New Year's Eve anti-government protest. Sowore ran for president of Nigeria in 2019 as the founder of the New York-based news outlet Sahara Reporters. He's previously been targeted and arrested for organizing protests against President Muhammadu Buhari and called for a popular revolution. To see our interview with Omoyele Sowore, you can go to democracynow.org. A warning to our viewers: this headline contains disturbing images. In China, images of a delivery driver who set himself on fire to protest unpaid wages has gone viral. The driver previously worked for the e-commerce giant Alibaba. He can be heard in social media videos telling witnesses who rushed to his aid, "I want my blood and sweat money back." His daughter has set up a crowdfunding page to help cover the cost of medical treatments for his severe burns. In U.S. labor news, the Service Employees International Union and drivers for ride-hailing companies are asking the California Supreme Court to invalidate Proposition 22, arguing it's unconstitutional. Prop 22, which passed in November, exempts companies like Uber and Lyft from having to classify their workers as employees rather than as independent contractors, depriving gig workers of basic wage and labor protections. The Associated Press reports former Michigan Governor Rick Snyder and other former officials are being charged in the wake of a new investigation of the Flint water crisis. In 2014, Flint's unelected emergency manager, appointed by then-Governor Snyder, switched Flint's water supply to the Flint River as a cost-saving measure. The move has been linked to at least 12 deaths from an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease and widespread lead poisoning in residents, including children, in the majority black city. To see our documentary on the poisoning of an American city, go to democracynow.org. And billionaire casino owner and Republican mega-donor Sheldon Adelson has died at the age of 87. Adelson was Donald Trump's largest single donor during the 2016 race. Since 2015, Adelson donated more than $250 million to Trump, other Republicans, and right-wing super PACs. He was also an influential political force in Israel, where he used his news outlets to back Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. He will be buried in Israel. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, we turn to Yale scholar Timothy Snyder, talking about the American abyss. Yes, a historian of fascism and political atrocity on Trump, the mob, and what comes next. Stay with us.